I really wanted Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League to be good, but the game at launch left much to be desired. Now it's been half a year since that launch, and on paper the game received some pretty big new additions. So I'm curious if Suicide Squad is actually any better or still really as bad as people say. So let's start with the biggest new addition for the new update, which is of course a new character, Mrs. Freeze. I think she's a lot of fun to play. Her big focus on dealing frost damage synergizes really well with the new gear for this season, so you can get pretty powerful really quickly. She can use pistols, assault rifles and heavy weapons, so that offers you some really great mid-range weapon options. I especially love her traversal, where you glide along this ice wave you create and you can periodically do loop-de-loops to decrease heat buildup and gain more speed. In my opinion, it's not as fun as Joker's rocket-powered umbrella though, which I also played around with a ton while doing research for this video. He can launch himself pretty high up with a rocket-powered jump, then use his umbrella to either slowly float down or surf on it for increased speed and mobility. You can also surf on the ground and then launch back up, so it allows you to traverse the city very quickly. But that is unfortunately where the good stuff ends, at least for the characters. While Mrs. Freeze's traversal is very fun, and I argue that's the strongest part of the game in general, her combat kit does not feel too different from the other characters. Sure, you get to freeze enemies more often, but these effects all trigger off the same combat mechanics you've been used to since the start of the game. Counters, critical hits, shield harvests, you know the stuff. So while those actions trigger new buffs, you're not actually doing anything different. And while the weapon combination of heavy, AR and pistol is new, those weapon types have been available since launch as well, so shooting does not feel different from the other characters either. The same is actually true for Joker, who again I also spent a decent amount of time with. He has a ton of ways to set enemies on fire and make his grenades better, but nothing to make him feel that different from the characters we already had. And to add insult to injury, unlocking these new characters isn't exactly enticing either. If you know what you're doing, it doesn't take that long, so that's good, but it's a grindy and tedious process. Basically, you have to level up in the season, which is on a separate track from your character level, and once you hit 25, you can do a mission to unlock Mrs. Freeze and add her to the roster. Since the average mission gives you about a level worth of season experience, you can imagine it's quite a bit of work to unlock that mission. Your other option is getting a high score in the endless horde mode killing time, because the higher mastery level you get before you leave, the more seasonal XP you get. So it is nice that there's a risk reward activity that lets you level much faster, but unfortunately I think that activity is also the most straightforward and uninspired one in the game. Once you're done grinding, the mission you have to do to unlock the character isn't anything special either. It's another mission objective you've already seen before, and then after that you get a cutscene that adds the new character to Task Force X. Now you can also buy the character from the store outright, which will cost you $10, and that kind of makes you wonder if they made the grind longer so you'd at least consider paying for Joker or Freeze. But yeah, I'm mostly disappointed with how little story that leaves us with, as next to an introductory comic scene and the character's unlock scene, we don't get a lot more for Mrs. Freeze, and we didn't get much more for the Joker either. And I would sort of be okay with that if there were bigger things going on in the story, but the other major plot point, which is saving the Flash, gets even less time and explanation. And yes, that also means that us killing the Justice League in the campaign was only a minor setback, as we'll likely get the other members back in upcoming content. And there's actually a tease for future content in the game already, but first let's go back to the roadmap, as there is way more content that was added for free since launch, so let's see if that is any better. And of course, a quick like on the video would be awesome. So we see the Superman and Flash fight, we'll touch on that in a moment, and below that we can see the ever-changing Metropolis, which you would hope is like a new location we can explore, but it just means that the Elseworld locations you travel to are now covered in snow. It fits the season theme, but apart from some new environmental hazards like giant ice shards that explode, they feel very samey and very similar to the previous Elseworlds missions as well. There was a new mission type I hadn't played that was added in a previous season though. Basically, you have to defend points to unlock a weak spot on a giant structure in the middle of the arena. The catch is that some enemies are phased into another dimension, and by interacting with the control point, you can shift to that dimension to actually damage them. That does mean you can no longer damage normal enemies, so you're constantly swapping back and forth to deal with whatever is in front of you. So at least some new gameplay elements, but this objective type was used twice in this season's new incursion missions, meaning it quickly lost its novelty. It also doesn't really work for Suicide Squad, as you constantly want to stay on the move as enemies are constantly shooting at you. So standing still to interact with an object multiple times during a mission is far from ideal. But the most annoying annoying thing I encountered was a new type of enemy who spawns with a shield that makes them invulnerable. You remove this shield by destroying the Green Lantern construct specifically made by those enemies, so that's not terrible, right? Well, the bad part is you don't see which Green Lantern construct is linked to which enemy, and sometimes they're out of sight as well, so you can't really see them. And if you skip the previous season like me, there is no tutorial telling you how to handle these enemies, so the first time you encounter them, you will struggle and likely fail because it's totally unclear what you have to do to damage them. After grinding out the new character, you'll also want to level up to season rank 30 and attempt the Mayhem mission, aka the seasonal Brainiac boss fight. This is the pinnacle of the season experience as it wraps up the season storyline, unlocks mastery modes and access to better gear, and offers you a new boss fight. Or well, new, it's a mashup fight where Brainiac alternates between using Flash powers and Superman's powers, which is the first time we've had a fight like that. So I was pretty excited, especially since I think the Superman fight was one of the better ones, but the mission didn't start strong with me having to blow up 2 cannons, which we've done a dozen times in the story already. So I got that over with and made it to the Brainiac fight, hoping that it would be better. Unfortunately, I actually think it was worse. The fact that there are ads spawning in during the fight and extra objectives you need to complete make this boss fight much more chaotic than the base game version. And since you have to be aware of 2 different movesets over the course of the fight, it became more stressful than fun. On top of that, at certain health thresholds, the camera zooms in on Brainiac as he taunts you, which would have been cool once, but having it happen 4 times during the same fight really kills the pace. So while I was initially excited for this mashup boss fight, I did not end up enjoying it. But even with those struggles, you're rewarded at the end with some of the new weapons and gear for this season. These are pretty good, I think. The Killer Frost stat has some very powerful buffs if you constantly apply freeze or burn, depending on which version of the set you're using. And the unique Notorious weapons and items also have some pretty unique effects, including the villainous synergy bonuses that you'll only discover by equipping different item combinations. The endgame loot cycle has been slightly reworked since launch, which means you can now get all 3 versions of the new Infamy set from the get-go and instead try to farm for the more powerful corrupted items at higher mastery levels. These are basically souped up versions of seasonal items with an even better unique buff than the basic one. The problem is though that even with a ton of new loot that's available right out of the gate, there's not enough to stop the gameplay from feeling repetitive. Sure, we get an awesome new assault rifle that allows you to set enemies on fire, then switch to a different ammo type that deals massive damage to enemies who are on fire, so that's pretty unique. But all it changes gameplay wise is that you now have to hold down the triangle button every once in a while to change ammo types. Normally, I don't think this would be as much of a problem, but because the rest of your objectives and gameplay loop are constantly the same, the thing you're working towards needs to be really enticing. And while some of these new items are really good, they're not changing the game in any meaningful way, like some of the crazy exotics in Destiny do, for example. Another slight problem is that while the new weapons and items work very well together, I haven't seen any crazy synergies with items from previous seasons. Could be because I'm missing a couple, but the Bane set, for example, was very focused on proccing Venom, whereas most new stuff focuses exclusively on fire and ice. So that means if you already had a powerful build, you're either keeping what you had, or you need to swap loadouts completely to benefit from the new perks on gear. We did actually get another gear related upgrade, as you now have access to a stash in the Hall of Justice to store your items. But with it only having double the capacity of your inventory and it being strangely laggy sometimes as well, it's not that great of an addition either. Kind of reminds me of the Borderlands storage situation where we also had way too little space for how many weapons there were for a large part of the game's lifecycle. So sadly, what we end up with is repetitive content, barely any story and rewards that, depending on what build you want to use, might not even be useful to you. And normally with live service games, the devs keep working on improvements, listening to feedback, but Rocksteady already has one foot out the door. We learned that many of the studio's employees are now helping to develop a new director's cut version of Hogwarts Legacy. Alongside that, they are also pitching their own single-player game, which is honestly great news, happy for them that they're returning to their strengths. But yeah, that does of course mean that there are way less people working on Suicide Squad than they'd originally planned. If you go over here on the map in-game, you will find the clock tower from Arkham Knight and a hint towards Deathshot's daughter Zoe becoming the next playable character in Season 3, or at least an alternate universe variant of her. So they again will keep supporting the game by releasing seasonal content, but considering the process for unlocking Zoe is likely the same as it was for Freeze, that is not enough to pull me back in. So maybe it's good that they are moving on sooner rather than later, because unless they put in the required resources to make some significant changes, Suicide Squad is not getting out of the downward spiral. Curious to hear your take in the comments as always. Subscribe for more content like this, leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and watch our hands-on preview with Star Wars Outlaws by clicking on the screen. I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.